Did civilization arrive like dawn, or did it awaken already wounded, carrying memories of something older it refused to name? The Sumerians wrote of beginnings with calm hands, yet lingered on endings, floods, silences, and cities that forgot their own breath. Clay tablets whisper of losses that feel deliberate, as if knowledge slipped away between lines or was gently set down and never lifted again. Tonight, let the questions rest beside you. Let uncertainty soften the edges of certainty. Stay here, listening to what history avoids saying, and walk with me into the long night where answers dim and meanings quietly wait. There is something strange in the way the Sumerians chose to remember themselves. When they pressed reeds into wet clay, they did not rush to explain how civilization began. They did not marvel at invention as if it were miraculous. Writing appears suddenly, fully formed, already confident, already administrative, already burdened with counting, naming, measuring. The tablets do not tremble with awe. They move as if arriving late to a story already underway. That absence, that calm refusal to explain origins, feels heavier than any declaration. It leaves behind a silence where beginnings should be. In the earliest layers of Mesopotamia, cities seem to rise not gradually but decisively. Uruk expands, organizes labor, constructs walls, defines time, and standardizes belief with an efficiency that feels rehearsed. Tools, seals, calendars, myths, none appear tentative. They behave like inheritances rather than discoveries. Archaeology names this momentum progress, yet the texture of the evidence suggests something quieter and more unsettling. Memory rather than invention, recollection rather than creativity. Civilization here does not look like a first step. It looks like a return. The Sumerians themselves offer no narrative of awakening from savagery. Their myths begin after order already exists. Kingship descends from the heavens not as a gift to primitives, but as a restoration after catastrophe. Even their gods do not create the world from nothing. They reorganize, negotiate, repair. The universe they inhabit feels old, worn, already marked by loss. This tone seeps into their language, where words for ruin, flood, and abandonment recur with an intimacy that suggests familiarity. These are not fears of the unknown. They are memories resurfacing. In city after city, archaeologists find layers of destruction beneath early urban planning, thick bands of silt, ash, and collapsed brick. Some attribute them to seasonal floods, others to warfare or neglect. Yet the Sumerians themselves speak of a great deluge not as mythic spectacle, but as historical trauma. Their flood stories lack triumph. Survival is quiet, almost reluctant. Afterward comes rebuilding, but also forgetting. Lists resume, temples are restored, names are recorded again. What vanishes is reflection. No one asks why the world had to be remade. This pattern, collapse followed by silence, repeats. Entire cities are abandoned without clear cause. Trade routes dissolve. Writing narrows from poetic breadth into rigid accounting. Knowledge becomes practical, then procedural, then sparse. Astronomical observations survive, but cosmological wonder recedes. Medical texts persist, but philosophical speculation thins. It feels less like growth interrupted and more like intentional narrowing, as though something expansive was deemed too dangerous to preserve. Later civilizations would treat the Sumerians as ancestors, yet even they struggled to read the earliest tablets. Language drifted, symbols hardened. What once carried layered meaning became formula. Scribes copied without comprehension, repeating words whose original resonance had faded. Memory turned mechanical. In this slow erosion, the past was not erased violently. It was softened, blurred, made unusable. There is an unease in realizing that the Sumerians themselves never framed this as tragedy. They wrote laments for destroyed cities, but never laments for lost understanding. They mourned temples, kings, and populations, yet never asked what had been known before. That omission feels deliberate, as if asking would reopen wounds that civilization was built to seal shut. Some scholars suggest that early urban life required forgetting. Complexity demands focus. Administration replaces contemplation. Survival in dense populations leaves little room for metaphysical curiosity. But this explanation feels incomplete. Forgetting here does not appear accidental. It aligns too neatly with the moments of rebuilding, with the reassertion of order after chaos. Each reset trims something away. Each return feels smaller. The Sumerian king lists stretch impossibly far into the past, assigning reigns that last tens of thousands of years. Modern interpretation dismisses this as symbolic exaggeration. Yet symbols too reveal intent. Why anchor authority in an unreachable antiquity? Why insist that time itself once moved differently? These gestures do not glorify progress. They anchor legitimacy in something lost, something no longer accessible. Even the land participates in this story. Southern Mesopotamia shows signs of salinization caused by intensive irrigation. Fields that once fed cities slowly poisoned themselves. Yields dropped. Populations shifted north. Environmental strain intertwined with social fragility. Civilization, it seems, carried the seeds of its own diminishment from the beginning. Growth was never neutral. It demanded sacrifices that accumulated quietly, patiently, until collapse felt inevitable. What lingers most is the tone of resignation embedded in Sumerian texts. Not despair, not outrage, but acceptance. The world ends, returns, ends again. Gods withdraw favour, cities fall, people rebuild. No questions are preserved asking whether the cycle could be broken. Perhaps such questions were once asked and later removed. Or perhaps they were never permitted to harden into record. The absence itself becomes a clue. A civilization that documents everything, grain, labour, stars, rituals, yet leaves origins unexamined may be revealing more than it conceals. Silence can be an artifact. Forgetting can be a technology. When survival depends on continuity, some memories become liabilities. As the clay dries and the reed marks fossilize into history, what remains is not a beginning, but a boundary. On one side lies a world already ancient, already damaged, already known too well. On the other stands civilization, orderly, efficient, and carefully incurious. Between them stretches a gap that was never meant to be crossed again. And somewhere within that gap, something important may still be waiting, unnamed, unremembered, and deliberately left behind. What followed the quiet refusal to explain beginnings was not ignorance, but a different kind of attention. The Sumerians looked forward only insofar as it allowed them to prepare for endings. Their calendars did not celebrate novelty, they measured recurrence. Days were counted not to anticipate progress, but to maintain balance with forces already known to fail. Time itself felt like a structure built to prevent surprise. In their myths, catastrophe is never shocking. Floods arrive as corrections, droughts emerge as consequences. Even the withdrawal of the gods feels procedural, as though divinity itself obeyed an older rule. This emotional restraint carries through their records. When cities fall, the language does not rage. It catalogues absence, streets empty, temples go quiet, fields stop answering. The tone suggests that collapse had been rehearsed long before it occurred. Across Mesopotamia, evidence accumulates of repeated disruptions, layers of sediment interrupt habitation. Irrigation systems overextend, then choke the soil with salt. Trade networks falter and reassemble elsewhere. These are not singular disasters. They are rhythms. Civilization pulses outward, then contracts, then resumes in altered form. Each contraction leaves behind fewer questions, fewer symbols, fewer layers of meaning. Writing itself transforms during these cycles. Early texts hold multiplicity. Signs shift depending on context. Meaning feels elastic. Over time, symbols narrow. Grammar stiffens. Ambiguity disappears. Language becomes safer but poorer. What once invited interpretation now demands obedience. Knowledge hardens into instruction. Memory becomes a tool rather than a landscape. This narrowing coincides with an increased focus on control. Legal codes multiply. Boundaries are clarified. Punishments are specified. The world is no longer something to wonder at, but something to regulate. Even the gods submit to bureaucratic roles. They preside over functions rather than mysteries. Divinity is domesticated, distributed across tasks that mirror human administration. Order replaces awe. It is tempting to read this as maturity, as civilization growing up. Yet maturity usually carries reflection. Here, reflection is absent. The Sumerians do not ask what has been lost. They move as if loss were a prerequisite for stability. Their laments mourn cities, but never the narrowing of thought that made such cities possible. The trade feels accepted, perhaps even desired. Somewhere along this path, curiosity becomes dangerous. Speculation threatens cohesion. Questions that reach too far risk destabilizing systems built to endure known failures. In such an environment, silence becomes protective. Forgetting becomes an act of care. What cannot be integrated is allowed to dissolve. Even the sky reflects this shift. Early astronomical observations track cycles with reverence, noting irregularities without forcing explanation. Later records emphasize prediction and control. Eclipses become omens to manage, not mysteries to contemplate. The heavens are folded into governance. The universe shrinks to fit the city. This contraction is not imposed violently. It feels consensual. The population accepts narrowing in exchange for survival. Complexity yields to clarity. Depth yields to function. Civilization learns to move efficiently by trimming away what cannot be standardized. What remains is stable, impressive, and strangely hollow. The Sumerians may have understood something modern societies struggle to admit. Not all knowledge strengthens a system. Some memories erode the foundations of order. Some questions dissolve authority. To build something that lasts, one must decide what to leave behind. In this light, the absence of origin stories feels intentional. Beginnings carry too much power. They invite comparison. They expose alternatives. Instead, the Sumerians anchor meaning in continuity. What matters is not where things came from, but that they continue. Kings rule because kings have always ruled. Cities matter because cities exist. The past is invoked only to reinforce the present, never to challenge it. Time loops inward. Yet beneath this stability lies tension. The very need for repetition suggests fragility. If order were natural, it would not require constant reinforcement. The careful maintenance of calendars, rituals, and records feels like an effort to hold something together against an unseen pressure. Perhaps what was forgotten continued to press from below. Archaeological gaps hinted interruptions too abrupt to explain away. Entire cultural practices vanish without replacement. Artistic motifs disappear. Religious emphases shift suddenly. These moments feel less like evolution and more like erasure, as if certain threads were cut deliberately to prevent their re-emergence. The Sumerians do not explain these shifts, they move past them. Silence seals the rupture. Later generations inherit the system without the memory of what it replaced. Over time, even the fact of replacement fades. Civilization presents itself as complete, self-originating, inevitable. But inevitability is often a mask worn by decisions long forgotten. What feels natural may simply be old enough to escape scrutiny. The Sumerians built a world that functioned by refusing to look backward too closely. In doing so, they preserved order at the cost of depth. This trade echoes through history. Civilizations that survive longest are often those most willing to forget. Memory complicates loyalty. Curiosity fractures unity. To endure, a system must narrow the field of thought. What begins as protection eventually becomes limitation. As the clay tablets settle into museums and translations flatten their nuance, the restraint embedded in them remains palpable. A civilization that catalogued the world with obsessive care chose silence where it mattered most. That choice shaped everything that followed. And so the question is not why the Sumerians failed to ask where civilization came from, but what they had already seen that made such a question unbearable. Beneath the order the Sumerians perfected, there remains a residue of unease, faint but persistent, like pressure beneath sealed stone. It emerges most clearly in the way they spoke about gods, not as distant creators, but as overseers who could depart. Divinity in Sumer was not eternal presence, it was conditional. Gods arrived, assigned functions, demanded maintenance, and sometimes withdrew without explanation. When they left, cities collapsed. This was not framed as punishment, but as consequence, as though divine absence followed rules older than worship itself. The gods did not give civilization its first breath, they merely sustained it. Their favour felt like a resource that could be depleted. Temples required constant labour, offerings, attention. Ritual was less communion than upkeep. To neglect the gods was to risk abandonment, not because the gods were vengeful, but because order itself was fragile. Civilization, in this worldview, existed on borrowed time. This sense of provisional stability echoes through Sumerian cosmology. The universe is not a harmonious whole, but a negotiated arrangement. Heaven and earth are separated by force. Chaos is not defeated, it is contained. The boundaries holding reality together demand vigilance. When those boundaries weaken, floods rise, kings fall, and memory dissolves. In such a world, endings are more fundamental than beginnings. The Sumerians catalogued omens obsessively, reading cracks in livers, movements of stars, distortions in dreams. These were not predictions of growth, but warnings of imbalance. Knowledge was oriented toward prevention. The future was something to guard against, not to embrace. This posture suggests prior experience. One does not build an entire system around averting collapse without having witnessed collapse before. Yet the records never describe a first fall. They begin in the aftermath. Civilization appears already defensive, already wary, already shaped by loss that cannot be spoken. The epic narratives reinforce this atmosphere. Heroes do not seek enlightenment, they seek endurance. Gilgamesh does not quest for wisdom to improve his city. He searches for escape from death, and fails. What he brings back is not knowledge, but resignation. Mortality is reaffirmed, limits are restored. The story ends not with transformation, but with acceptance of walls, bricks, and measured days. This theme recurs across texts. Attempts to transcend boundaries are met with correction. Immortality belongs elsewhere. Excess ambition invites disaster. Even survival after catastrophe carries a cost. Those who outlive the flood do not rebuild the world as it was. Something remains broken, unnamed, permanently out of reach. Such stories do not inspire progress. They caution against it. They teach restraint, humility, and repetition. Civilization is framed not as ascent, but as containment. The goal is not to reach higher, but to avoid falling further. Archaeological evidence aligns with this inward-turning philosophy. Early monumental architecture gives way to standardized modular construction. Artistic variation narrows, innovation slows, systems refine rather than expand. This is not stagnation, it is consolidation. A culture choosing to stabilize rather than explore. The choice appears rational in context. The environment was volatile. Rivers shifted unpredictably. Soil degraded. External threats loomed. Survival demanded efficiency. But efficiency has a shadow. It rewards what can be measured and punishes what cannot. Over time, intangible knowledge, symbolic, speculative, disruptive, loses ground. What disappears is not technology, but orientation. The sense that the world could be otherwise fades. Alternatives collapse into impossibility. The present becomes the only conceivable configuration. History flattens. Later civilizations inherit this flattened inheritance. They adopt Sumerian frameworks without absorbing the unease that shaped them. Gods become creators. Kings become chosen. Order becomes destiny rather than defense. What began as a response to fragility is reinterpreted as proof of inevitability. Yet traces remain. Inconsistencies linger in myths. Contradictions persist in chronologies. Flood layers interrupt the soil. King lists stretch credibility. These anomalies are often dismissed as symbolic, but symbols too preserve tension. They encode unresolved memory. Some researchers note abrupt shifts in population and material culture that resist gradual explanation. Entire traditions vanish between layers, replaced by simpler forms. The continuity implied by historical narratives masks episodes of rupture. Civilization resets, again and again, each time emerging leaner, more controlled, less curious. This repeated narrowing raises an unsettling possibility. Perhaps civilization did not simply forget its origins. Perhaps it learned that remembering them was destabilizing. Perhaps the knowledge of what came before carried implications incompatible with long-term order. If earlier forms of organization existed, less hierarchical, less centralized, more attuned to natural rhythms, they may have left behind insights that threatened emerging power structures. To govern effectively, those insights had to be neutralized. Not erased violently, but allowed to fade. Forgetting in this sense becomes strategy. Memory is curated. The past is shaped to justify the present. Over generations, this curation solidifies into tradition. What was once chosen becomes assumed. The Sumerians stand at the threshold of this process. They are close enough to the rupture to feel it, but already committed to its suppression. Their texts vibrate with restraint. Their silence is careful. They do not deny loss. They simply refuse to explore it. As centuries pass, even that refusal becomes invisible. Civilization moves forward, carrying a foundation it no longer recognizes as provisional. What began as a shelter becomes a prison of assumptions, yet the earliest clay still holds the imprint of hesitation. In the pauses between lines, in the repetition of warnings, in the emphasis on endings, something unresolved persists. Civilization may have survived by looking away, but the cost of that avoidance remains embedded in its structure, and as the night deepens, that ancient restraint still echoes, reminding us that what is most carefully preserved is often what we are most afraid to remember. What the Sumerians preserved with such care was structure. Yet beneath that structure lay a quiet recognition that order was never permanent. This awareness surfaces most clearly in their laments, texts written not to record victory but to ritualize loss. Cities speak in the first person, describing abandonment as something expected rather than shocking. Walls crumble, temples empty, gods depart. The voice is mournful but not surprised. Collapse arrives as fulfillment, not interruption. These laments were not hidden. They were copied, taught, recited. A civilization does not repeatedly rehearse its own destruction, unless it believes destruction to be intrinsic to its existence. In Sumer, loss was not an exception. It was a phase. The purpose of remembering it was not to prevent its return, but to endure it with dignity. This orientation shapes how the Sumerians understood power. Kingship was not absolute authority, but a temporary role, granted and withdrawn by forces beyond human reach. Even the most celebrated rulers are described as caretakers rather than architects of destiny. Their legitimacy rests on maintenance, not innovation. To rule was to preserve balance, not to transform reality. The idea of progress, so central to later civilizations, feels alien here. Change is treated with suspicion. Innovation threatens equilibrium. Stability, even when harsh, is preferable to novelty. This mindset leaves little room for exploring origins. Origins imply alternatives. Alternatives invite comparison. Comparison weakens obedience. Instead, legitimacy flows downward from an unreachable past. The king lists extend time beyond comprehension, anchoring authority in deep antiquity. The impossibility of these reigns is often explained away symbolically, but symbolism itself carries intention. By stretching the past beyond verification, the present is insulated from critique. What has always been cannot be challenged. This insulation is reinforced through ritual repetition. Festivals reenact cosmic order. Myths are recited unchanged. The same gestures bind generations together. Over time, repetition replaces understanding. Meaning becomes embodied rather than examined. Participation matters more than interpretation. Within this framework, forgetting becomes a form of cohesion. Shared amnesia creates unity. Everyone agrees not to look too closely at what preceded the current arrangement. The absence of origin stories is not a gap to be filled, but a boundary to be respected. Environmental stress deepens this posture. The land itself resists permanence. Rivers shift course. Floods erase fields, salt creeps into soil. Agricultural success carries long-term consequences that undermine future stability. The Sumerians respond not by reimagining their relationship to the land, but by doubling down on control. More canals, more regulation, more labor. This intensification accelerates fragility. Systems become efficient but brittle. When disruption comes, it comes quickly. Recovery requires simplification. Complexity collapses inward. Each cycle leaves behind a leaner version of what came before. In this context, memory becomes dangerous. To remember earlier, more flexible ways of living would expose the rigidity of the present. It would suggest that alternatives once existed and could exist again. For a civilization dependent on tight coordination, such awareness is destabilizing. Thus, the past is curated. Certain myths persist because they reinforce limits. Others fade because they hint at possibility. The stories that survive teach obedience to boundaries, between gods and humans, between heaven and earth, between life and death. Transgression is punished, restraint is rewarded. Even the afterlife reflects this containment. There is no grand moral reckoning, no transformative continuation. The dead descend into a shadowed existence where distinctions blur. Existence continues, but meaning thins. Immortality is neither promised nor pursued. The emphasis returns to the living world and its fragile order. This worldview discourages radical imagination. It trains attention inward, toward maintenance rather than exploration. Civilization becomes an act of vigilance. Every day is spent holding chaos at bay. In such a posture, curiosity feels like a luxury, even a threat. Over generations, this vigilance hardens into tradition. What began as response to instability becomes identity. The reasons fade, the practices remain. The system outlives the memory of why it was built. Later, cultures inherit the structure without the caution that shaped it. They see order and mistake it for confidence. They adopt kingship and divinity as absolutes rather than provisional arrangements. The humility embedded in Sumerian texts dissolves. Authority expands. Progress becomes an ideal rather than a risk. Yet the cracks remain. Environmental limits reassert themselves. Social strain accumulates. Empires rise and fall with increasing scale and speed. Each collapse echoes earlier patterns, though the lessons are rarely recognized as such. The Sumerians stand at the beginning of this long repetition. They are close enough to the original ruptures to sense their danger, but committed enough to survival to avoid naming them. Their silence is not ignorance. It is caution refined into culture. What they leave behind is not an explanation, but a posture. Civilization as something always on the verge, always needing reinforcement, always aware, at least subconsciously, of its own impermanence. This awareness hums beneath the surface of their records, steady and unresolved. As the laments fade into archives and the rituals cease to be performed, the restraint they encoded persists invisibly. It travels forward, shaping institutions that no longer remember its origin. The decision to forget becomes tradition. Tradition becomes truth. And so the story continues, not as a straight line from darkness to light, but as a narrowing corridor built to protect against memories deemed too heavy to carry. Somewhere beyond that corridor lies a wider landscape, glimpsed only in fragments, where different choices once existed. The Sumerians sensed it, stepped away from it, and built a world designed never to look back. As the Sumerian world narrowed inward, another shift quietly unfolded, one less visible in architecture or law, but deeply etched into how meaning itself was carried forward. Knowledge began to detach from experience. What had once lived in observation, ritual nuance and layered symbolism slowly migrated into fixed forms. Tablets multiplied, yet understanding thinned. The act of recording replaced the act of knowing. Early Sumerian writing feels alive with flexibility. Signs bend depending on context. A single mark can hold sound, image, and idea at once, meaning moves. But over time, the script stabilizes. Ambiguity becomes inefficiency. Symbols harden into standardized values. This is celebrated as progress, yet something subtle is lost. When language stops shifting, it stops listening. The scribe emerges as a distinct figure in this transition. No longer merely a recorder of communal memory, the scribe becomes a gatekeeper. Literacy concentrates. Knowledge stratifies. What was once embedded in shared ritual becomes enclosed within institutions. Understanding turns professional. Memory acquires rank. This professionalization brings power. Administrative writing supports taxation, labor control, legal enforcement. The tablet becomes an instrument of order. Its authority lies not in insight but in permanence. What is written cannot argue back. Over time, written knowledge begins to outrank lived experience. Reality bends toward the record. In this environment, speculative thought becomes impractical. Questions that cannot be resolved into procedure fade from relevance. The unknown is tolerated only if it can be categorized as omen or threat. Wonder yields to warning. Curiosity is rebranded as risk. The Sumerians do not articulate this transformation directly, but its effects ripple through their culture. Medical texts list symptoms and treatments with precision, yet rarely explore causes. Astronomical records track movement meticulously, but cosmological interpretation narrows. Everything useful is preserved. Everything unsettling dissolves. This selective preservation reshapes the relationship between humans and the cosmos. The universe is no longer a partner in meaning, but a system to be monitored. Signs are read not to understand existence, but to anticipate disruption. Knowledge becomes defensive. The same pattern appears in religious practice. Early mythic imagery suggests intimacy between gods and world. Over time, that intimacy formalizes. Rituals grow rigid, offerings become transactional, divine presence is managed rather than encountered. Faith transforms into maintenance. As systems tighten, deviation grows costly. To question the structure is to threaten stability. Those who remember differently, who sense alternatives, are quietly sidelined by irrelevance. Their insights lack administrative value. Without inscription, they vanish. What remains is a civilization increasingly confident in its records and increasingly distant from its origins. The past becomes a ledger rather than a landscape. Events are dated, not felt. Causes are listed, not traced. Memory becomes flat. This flattening has consequences. When disruption arrives, as it inevitably does, the system responds with repetition rather than adaptation. The same solutions are applied to new problems. Canals are rebuilt. Rituals are repeated. Kings are replaced. But the underlying orientation remains unchanged. Archaeological strata reveal these moments of strain. Layers compress. Art simplifies. Diversity contracts. Each recovery restores function, but not depth. The civilization survives, but at a diminished register. This gradual thinning of meaning may explain the strange emotional tone of later Sumerian texts. They feel tired, competent but weary, capable of managing complexity yet lacking exuberance. The world is something to endure, not to explore. The decision to prioritize stability over inquiry is understandable. Life in Mesopotamia demanded coordination. Risk carried collective cost. But over centuries, caution calcifies. What begins as adaptation becomes doctrine. What once protected life begins to constrain it. By the time later cultures encounter Sumerian knowledge, they inherit its forms without its context. Writing appears as invention rather than compromise. Kingship seems ordained rather than provisional. Order looks natural rather than engineered. The silence around origins deepens. In this inheritance, the narrowing becomes invisible. Successive civilizations adopt the tools without sensing the restraint that shaped them. They push expansion without acknowledging fragility. They chase progress without remembering why caution once mattered. Yet the unease persists, carried forward in mythic echoes and recurring collapses. Each empire believes itself unprecedented. Each fall reenacts familiar patterns. Memory remains incomplete. The Sumerians stand at the threshold of this long forgetting. They are not naive architects of civilization, but its careful custodians, aware that something had already gone wrong. Their solution was not to recover what was lost, but to build something that could function without it. This choice shaped everything that followed. Civilization learned to survive by narrowing its gaze. Knowledge learned to persist by shedding complexity. Memory learned to last by becoming manageable. But what is manageable is not always sufficient. Beneath the orderly surface of records and rituals, something restless remains. A sense that what was preserved was only part of the story. That something essential was set aside, not because it was false, but because it was too difficult to carry forward. As the clay tablets endure long after voices fade, they bear witness not only to what was written, but to what was omitted. In those omissions, a different history hums quietly. A history of choices made in fear, restraint, and survival. And in the stillness of that hum, the cost of forgetting continues to unfold, patient and unresolved, waiting for someone to notice that endurance and understanding are not the same thing. By the time Sumerian civilization reached its mature form, forgetting was no longer an absence. It had become a system. Memory was no longer something that drifted away with time. It was something actively shaped, filtered, and redirected. What survived did so because it fit within the narrow corridors civilization had built for itself. What did not fit was allowed to erode quietly, without record, without protest. This is visible in how the past is referenced. Earlier epochs are invoked not for their ideas, but for their authority. Names of ancient kings, cities, and gods are repeated like anchors, stripped of context and complexity. The past becomes a source of weight, not wisdom. Its role is to stabilize the present, not to illuminate alternatives. In this environment, time loses depth. It stretches backward into abstraction and forward into repetition. Change becomes cyclical rather than transformative. Each generation inherits forms already hollowed by use. Ritual continues, but its inattention fades. What once carried urgency becomes habit. The result is a civilization deeply skilled at continuity and deeply uncomfortable with rupture. When rupture occurs, it is framed as failure rather than signal. The response is restoration, not re-evaluation. Systems are repaired to resemble what existed before, even if those systems contributed to the collapse. Archaeological records echo this stubbornness. After major disruptions, rebuilding follows familiar patterns. City plans repeat. Administrative structures reappear. Even mistakes are reproduced. Innovation is rare in recovery phases. The goal is to return, not to rethink. This behavior suggests an underlying fear that deviation itself is dangerous, that the unknown carries risks greater than the known failures of the past. Stability, even compromised stability, is preferred over uncertainty. Such fear does not arise in a vacuum. It grows from experience. The Sumerians lived on land that punished miscalculation swiftly. Floods did not forgive error. Droughts did not negotiate. In such conditions, experimentation could be fatal. Over time, caution became virtue. Restraint became morality. But when caution hardens into identity, it begins to shape perception itself. Possibility narrows. What lies beyond established boundaries is no longer merely risky. It becomes unthinkable. Language adapts accordingly. Words for innovation thin. Words for order multiply. The gods mirror this shift. They become enforcers of balance rather than sources of revelation. Their messages arrive as warnings, not invitations. Divine communication reinforces limits. Transgression is punished not because it is immoral, but because it destabilizes the system. This worldview leaves little space for recovering what was lost. To seek earlier knowledge would require stepping outside sanctioned memory. It would mean questioning why the system exists as it does. Such questioning threatens cohesion. Silence becomes safer. Over generations, this safety calcifies. The original reasons for restraint fade, but the restraint remains. What was once a response to trauma becomes tradition. Tradition becomes law. Law becomes truth. Later cultures mistake this truth for origin. They look at the Sumerian record and see beginnings rather than aftermath. Writing is labelled invention. Kingship is labelled genesis. Urban life is treated as emergence rather than reconstruction. The silence around what came before is misread as absence rather than refusal. This misreading reshapes history itself. Civilization becomes a story of ascent rather than survival. Collapse becomes anomaly rather than pattern. Forgetting is rebranded as ignorance rather than strategy. Yet the patterns repeat. Each civilization inherits structures without their original caution. Expansion accelerates. Confidence grows. Limits are tested. When collapse comes, it arrives faster and on a larger scale. The cycle tightens. The Sumerians stand at the quiet center of this repetition. They did not celebrate expansion. They did not chase transcendence. They built carefully, defensively, with eyes fixed on endurance. Their refusal to explore origins was not naivete. It was restraint born of recognition. They understood that knowing too much about what had come before might destabilize what they were trying to hold together. If earlier forms of existence had been broader, more fluid, less hierarchical, remembering them would expose the artificiality of the present order. It would reveal that civilization was a choice, not a destiny. To survive, that choice had to disappear from view. Thus, forgetting becomes foundational. Not forgetting events, but forgetting alternatives. The world narrows not because imagination fails, but because imagination is dangerous. Civilization trains itself to look only where it is allowed. This training echoes forward. Modern systems, too, privilege documentation over understanding, procedure over meaning, continuity over reflection. The lineage is not direct, but the posture is familiar. Stability is protected by silence. Order is maintained by omission. The Sumerians did not write manifestos about this. They did not announce a decision to forget. They simply structured life so that remembering differently was no longer possible. Over time, even the memory of forgetting vanished. What remains is a civilization that appears complete, confident, and foundational, yet carries within it the imprint of avoidance. Its greatest legacy is not writing or cities, but a method of survival that trades depth for durability. As the centuries pass and the clay tablets harden beyond repair, the restraint embedded within them continues its work. Civilization moves forward, carrying its silence intact. What was once set aside remains unreachable, not because it is lost, but because the path back was never meant to stay open. And so the forgetting continues, quiet and effective, shaping the world not by what it remembers, but by what it has learned never to recall. As forgetting settled into habit, the Sumerian landscape itself began to mirror the inward turn of thought. The land was no longer simply inhabited, it was engineered, segmented, disciplined. Rivers were redirected, fields divided, labour scheduled with precision. Nature became a system to be managed, not a partner to be interpreted. This transformation carried profound consequences, not only for ecology, but for how reality itself was perceived. Irrigation made cities possible, yet it also bound them to a narrow rhythm. Water arrived by design, not by surprise. The flood, once a mystery, became a calculation. But calculations demand consistency. When the rivers shifted beyond expectation, the system strained. Salt accumulated, soil hardened. Productivity declined slowly, almost politely, until recovery required ever greater effort for diminishing return. This environmental narrowing paralleled a cognitive one. As the land demanded control, so did meaning. Everything valuable had to be regulated, predicted, stabilized. What could not be controlled was framed as threat. Over time, uncertainty itself became suspect. The Sumerians responded not by loosening their grip, but by tightening it. More canals, more labour quotas, more ritual precision. The system doubled down on itself, reinforcing patterns even as their effectiveness waned. This insistence on continuity reveals something deeper than stubbornness. It suggests an aversion to reimagining fundamentals. Reimagining would require acknowledging that the relationship between humans, land, and order might be flawed. It would require questioning assumptions inherited from a past already obscured. Such questioning would open the door to alternatives, and alternatives threaten cohesion. Thus, the world was interpreted through increasingly rigid frameworks. Omens proliferated, signs were catalogued, deviations were absorbed into predictive models. The unknown was not explored, it was neutralized by classification. Wonder became warning. This transformation subtly reshaped spiritual life. The gods, once forces of disruption and revelation, were absorbed into maintenance cycles. Their role was to ensure continuity, not to introduce novelty. Divine will aligned with administrative need. Heaven and bureaucracy reflected each other. In this alignment, power stabilized. Authority flowed smoothly because the cosmos itself appeared orderly. Questioning the system became synonymous with courting chaos. The boundaries between natural law, divine command, and political rule blurred. Such blurring is effective. When structure feels universal, resistance feels unnatural. Over generations, people learn not only to obey, but to think within sanctioned limits. Imagination contracts without noticing its own confinement. The archaeological record captures the results. Diversity of material culture diminishes. Regional variation narrows. Standardization spreads. The civilization grows uniform, efficient, and increasingly fragile. When disruption occurs, its impact is widespread. Homogeneity accelerates collapse. Yet each collapse is met with restoration rather than reconsideration. The same systems are rebuilt, the same assumptions reinstated. The land is reworked despite its exhaustion. Memory repeats rather than adapts. This repetition hints at a deeper loyalty, not to outcomes, but to form. The Sumerians were committed to a vision of order that had become inseparable from survival itself. To abandon it would feel like erasing identity. But identity rooted in control carries risk. When circumstances change beyond manageable parameters, rigidity becomes liability. The system designed to prevent collapse hastens it. Still, the records remain calm. There is no outcry against the land, no questioning of the approach. Responsibility is diffused, attributed to gods, fate, imbalance. Human agency dissolves into maintenance roles. This diffusion protects cohesion. It spares the system from critique. If failure originates beyond human design, design itself remains unquestioned. Over time, this posture spreads beyond Sumer. Successor cultures adopt similar relationships to land and order. Control replaces conversation. Management replaces understanding. Civilization becomes an exercise in containment. The consequences echo forward. Landscapes degrade. Systems expand beyond resilience. Each society believes itself uniquely advanced, yet reenacts familiar patterns. The memory of earlier restraint is gone, replaced by confidence. The Sumerians, however, still sense the tension. Their laments speak of land turning against its people, of abundance fading into scarcity. But these observations never mature into structural critique. They're absorbed into cycles of mourning and restoration. This absorption is itself a form of forgetting. By ritualizing loss, its causes are softened. Grief replaces inquiry. Acceptance replaces adaptation. The quiet tragedy lies not in collapse, but in the refusal to learn differently from it. Civilization survives by repeating what once worked, even as conditions change. Memory becomes circular. What might have been possible, different relationships to land, power, and meaning, slips further from reach. Alternatives fade not because they are disproven, but because they are unimagined. The Sumerians did not lack intelligence or awareness. They lacked permission. The system they built did not allow its own reconsideration. Stability required silence. Silence required forgetting. As the canal silted and the soil whitened with salt, the inward turn completed itself. Civilization became a closed loop, efficient yet exhausted, confident yet constrained. This posture would be inherited, refined, and magnified by those who followed. The narrowing would feel natural, the forgetting would feel inevitable. Yet beneath the routines, beneath the rituals, beneath the carefully measured days, the land continued to change. It did not honor tradition. It did not preserve order. It responded only to reality. And in that quiet mismatch, between systems built to endure and a world that refused to remain static, the earliest lesson of civilization lingered, unspoken and unresolved, that survival achieved through control alone eventually forgets how to listen. As systems hardened and repetition replaced reflection, a quieter transformation unfolded within the inner life of the civilization. Meaning itself grew thinner, not through loss of information, but through loss of intimacy. The world was still named, measured, and recorded, yet it was no longer felt as deeply. Symbols survived, but the sensations that once animated them faded. Early Sumerian imagery carried weight because it emerged from lived tension. Gods were close, unpredictable, capable of disruption. Nature was generous and violent in equal measure. Over time, this immediacy receded. What remained were representations detached from the conditions that birthed them. Rituals continued, but their emotional charge softened. Participation replaced encounter. This shift altered how people related to suffering. Loss became normalized. Floods, famine, abandonment. These were no longer crises demanding new understanding, but events to be endured within known frames. Laments gave voice to grief, yet they did not seek transformation. They guided emotion into acceptance, not action. Acceptance, repeated across generations, reshaped expectation. People learned what could be hoped for and what could not. Desire narrowed. Ambition adjusted itself downward. The future was imagined as continuation rather than change. Stability, even diminished stability, became the horizon of aspiration. This emotional economy supported the broader structure. A population trained to endure is easier to govern than one driven to question. When suffering is framed as inevitable, responsibility disperses. The system remains intact even as conditions worsen. The texts reflect this internal alignment. Personal voice fades. Individual experience dissolves into formula. Prayers repeat established patterns. Requests are predictable. The language of supplication becomes standardized. Emotion is expressed, but within boundaries that prevent deviation. Over time, even grief becomes procedural. Loss is acknowledged through prescribed words and gestures. Mourning follows script. What is felt privately is absorbed into public order. The system provides space for sorrow, but not for reconsideration. This containment extends to identity itself. The individual exists primarily as role, worker, scribe, priest, ruler. Selfhood aligns with function. Meaning is derived from contribution to continuity, rather than exploration of possibility. To exist well is to perform correctly. Such alignment creates resilience of a certain kind. The society can absorb shocks without fracturing immediately. People know how to respond. They know what is expected, but this resilience is brittle. It depends on conditions remaining within known limits. When conditions exceed those limits, the absence of imaginative flexibility becomes apparent. There is no language for reconfiguration, only for restoration. The system responds to unprecedented stress with familiar gestures, even when those gestures no longer apply. Archaeological evidence suggests moments when this gap widened. Settlements shrink. Art simplifies further. Cultural expression contracts. These are not signs of ignorance, but of exhaustion. The civilization continues, but with reduced bandwidth. Yet even in exhaustion, the posture holds. There is no recorded turn toward radical rethinking. The silence persists. The narrowing completes itself. Later observers often mistake this silence for certainty. They see order and assume confidence. They see longevity and assume success. But longevity can coexist with quiet diminishment. Endurance does not guarantee depth. The Sumerians endured by lowering the volume of possibility. They learned to live within a smaller range of meaning. In doing so, they preserved structure while letting other dimensions fade. This pattern repeats beyond Sumer. Civilizations that follow adopt similar emotional economies. They ritualize loss, standardize grief, and normalize strain. Over time, the extraordinary becomes ordinary. The unacceptable becomes expected. The cost is subtle. People forget not only alternatives, but the feeling that alternatives could exist. The world appears fixed. Reality feels complete. Questions lose urgency. This loss of urgency is perhaps the most profound consequence of forgetting. Without urgency, memory stagnates. History becomes archive rather than teacher. The past is consulted for authority, not insight. The Sumerians stand at the threshold of this transition. They are early enough to feel the tension, but late enough to accept its necessity. Their world required restraint to survive. That restraint reshaped emotion itself. What began as adaptation became inheritance. The emotional narrowing passed forward, embedded in institutions that outlived their context. Later, civilizations inherited not only tools and myths, but a way of feeling about the world. That way of feeling favors endurance over wonder, control over curiosity, repetition over risk. It produces stability, but at a cost that accumulates quietly. In moments of collapse, when structures fail and rituals lose coherence, fragments of the old attention resurface. Confusion spreads, anxiety deepens. Without familiar frames, people feel unmoored. The system's strength reveals its shadow. Yet even then, recovery seeks restoration rather than reinvention. The cycle resumes, memory closes again. The Sumerians may not have named this pattern, but they lived within it. Their legacy is not merely the first cities or the first writing, but a template for survival through emotional containment. As the centuries stretch forward, this template remains influential. Civilization continues to prioritize what can be stabilized over what can be understood. The narrowing persists, refined and justified by new languages and technologies. Still, beneath the layers of order, the human capacity for wonder does not disappear. It waits. It surfaces in moments of disruption, in art, in doubt, in the quiet sense that something essential has been misplaced. The Sumerians sensed this displacement but chose endurance. Their choice echoes forward, shaping worlds that still struggle to remember how to feel beyond what is permitted. And in that struggle, the ancient silence remains, not empty but dense with what was set aside, holding the weight of possibilities once felt, then slowly, carefully, allowed to fade. With endurance secured through narrowing, the question of authority settled into a deeper stillness. Power no longer needed to justify itself through explanation or innovation. It justified itself through continuity. What had been preserved long enough acquired the aura of inevitability. Rule became less an act and more a condition. In Sumer, Authority was layered carefully. Kings did not rule alone. They ruled within a lattice of priests, scribes, omens, and inherited forms. This diffusion created resilience. No single failure could undo the system. Yet it also blurred responsibility. When hardship arrived, there was no clear agent to question. Power dissolved into structure. This dissolution shaped obedience. People were not asked to believe, they were asked to participate. Ritual, labour, taxation, and record-keeping folded individuals into a larger rhythm. Compliance felt natural because it was repetitive. Over time, repetition replaced persuasion. The absence of origin stories plays a quiet role here. To ask where authority comes from is to expose its contingency. If kingship had a beginning, it could have an end. By rooting legitimacy in an unreachable past, the system insulated itself from scrutiny. Authority appeared as inheritance rather than choice. The gods reinforced this posture. Divine command mirrored administrative order. Omens validated decisions after the fact. Favour was withdrawn not through argument, but through calamity. When crops failed or cities fell, the explanation lay in imbalance, not in justice. The system remained intact, even in suffering. Such framing is powerful. It shifts attention away from human design toward cosmic necessity. Questions dissolve before they fully form. Discontent is absorbed into ritual lament rather than organized critique. The Sumerians refined this mechanism early. Their texts rarely debate policy. They record outcomes. They note what happened, not why it was arranged as it was. This emphasis trains memory to accept rather than evaluate. Over generations, this acceptance becomes identity. People understand themselves as caretakers of a fragile order, rather than participants in shaping it. Stability becomes moral. Change becomes suspect. This moralization of stability carries subtle consequences. When the system produces harm, that harm is interpreted as unavoidable. Suffering acquires meaning without explanation. The world feels harsh but necessary. The archaeological record hints at the human cost of this posture. Nutritional stress appears in skeletal remains. Labour demands intensify. Inequality grows more visible. Yet these conditions do not provoke recorded re-evaluation. They are endured within the same frames that produced them. Endurance, once adaptive, becomes self-reinforcing. To question the system would require admitting that endurance itself might not be virtuous. Such admission threatens the emotional economy that holds society together. Thus, authority persists not through force alone, but through shared restraint. People learn not to imagine alternatives because imagining feels dangerous. The unknown becomes synonymous with collapse. Later civilizations inherit this orientation. They expand its scale, refine its mechanisms, but retain its core logic. Power cloaks itself in tradition. Tradition obscures choice. Choice fades from memory. In this inheritance, the Sumerians are remembered as founders rather than survivors. Their caution is misread as confidence. Their restraint becomes precedent. The silence around origins deepens into assumption. Yet within Sumerian texts, hints of tension remain. Kings boast of restoring order after chaos, suggesting chaos was never far away. Laws emphasize punishment, implying persistent disobedience. Omens proliferate, indicating anxiety beneath control. These hints suggest authority was always under pressure. Stability required constant reinforcement. The system's strength lay in its ability to absorb strain without changing form. Absorption, however, is not transformation. It delays reckoning but does not resolve it. Over time, strain accumulates. The gap between lived reality and sanctioned meaning widens. When collapse finally exceeds the system's capacity, it appears sudden. Cities empty, administration falters, ritual loses coherence, authority dissolves. Observers interpret this as failure, yet it may be the inevitable outcome of long-contained tension. Even then, recovery follows familiar paths. New rulers adopt old forms. New cities replicate old layouts. The cycle resumes, slightly altered but fundamentally unchanged. This repetition reveals the durability of the underlying posture. Authority survives collapse because it is embedded not only in institutions, but in expectation. People know how to obey. They know how to endure. They do not know how to imagine otherwise. The Sumerians did not invent this posture, but they articulated it early. Their world demanded coordination. Their survival depended on restraint. In choosing endurance over exploration, They shaped the emotional and political grammar of civilization. That grammar persists. Modern systems, too, rely on continuity to justify authority. They privilege procedure over reflection. They frame disruption as anomaly rather than signal. They ask people to adapt emotionally rather than structurally. The lineage is not linear, but the resonance is clear. Civilization learns to protect itself by narrowing the field of thought. Authority thrives where alternatives are forgotten. Yet forgetting is never complete. Beneath the surface of obedience, questions linger. They surface in moments of crisis, when rituals fail and explanations thin. They appear as unease, dissatisfaction, or quiet disbelief. The Sumerians felt this unease. Their texts carry it as background noise, a low hum beneath the order. They did not resolve it. They contained it. Containment allowed civilization to persist, but it also ensured that the deeper question, whether order itself was the right answer, remained unasked. That question was too destabilizing to preserve. As time stretches forward, the unasked question becomes invisible. Authority feels natural, continuity feels necessary, forgetting feels like peace. But peace built on silence carries a hidden cost. It postpones understanding, it defers reckoning, it binds survival to repetition. In the stillness of Sumer's legacy, authority stands not as triumph, but as compromise, a structure erected to endure known dangers by refusing to confront unknown possibilities. And as the night deepens, that compromise continues to shape the world, quietly guiding how power is accepted, how suffering is interpreted, and how the most fundamental questions are left waiting, unanswered, just beyond the edge of permitted memory. By the time later cultures encountered the remnants of Sumer, the silence surrounding origins had already done its work. What remained looked complete. Cities, laws, myths, and measurements appeared to stand on their own, as if they had emerged naturally from human ingenuity. The compromises that shaped them were no longer visible. Survival had been mistaken for destiny. Those who came after did not inherit Sumerian caution. They inherited Sumerian structures. Writing was taken as proof of advancement, not as a tool born of restraint. Kingship was adopted as divine right, not as provisional stewardship. Order was celebrated, not feared. The inward turn that once served as protection was reinterpreted as confidence. This reinterpretation marked a subtle but profound shift. Where the Sumerians had treated civilization as fragile, their successors treated it as inevitable. Expansion replaced endurance, growth replaced balance. The careful narrowing that once kept collapse at bay was loosened, even reversed, without awareness of why it existed in the first place. Empires rose on this misreading. They pushed outward, standardized further, centralized more aggressively. The old systems were scaled up without their original humility. Control intensified. Distance between authority and consequence widened. The land was worked harder. Labor was extracted more thoroughly. Confidence grew. Yet the underlying patterns remained. Environmental strain followed expansion. Administrative complexity outpaced adaptability. Meaning thinned as scale increased. Collapse, when it came, was sharper and more dramatic, precisely because the systems had forgotten how provisional they were. Each empire told itself a story of uniqueness. Each believed it had surpassed the limits of those before. But beneath these stories lay inherited assumptions that traced quietly back to Sumer. The idea that order must be preserved at all costs, the belief that continuity justifies itself, the habit of addressing failure through restoration rather than reconsideration. The Sumerians had lived close enough to catastrophe to respect it. Their successors lived far enough from memory to dismiss it. This distance altered how power behaved. Authority became louder, punishment became harsher, dissent became more dangerous. As systems grew, silence deepened. The absence of origin stories expanded into absence of structural questioning. Civilization learned to speak confidently about progress while remaining mute about its foundations. This muteness shaped historical memory. The past was arranged as a linear ascent. Ruptures were smoothed over. Alternatives were erased not by force, but by omission. What did not fit the story was simply not told. The irony is that the Sumerians themselves might not have recognized this story as their own. They did not imagine civilization as a triumph. They experienced it as a necessity. Their writings carry caution rather than pride. Their myths warn rather than inspire. Their silences suggest boundaries rather than ignorance. But caution does not translate easily across generations. What begins as wisdom becomes limitation. What begins as restraint becomes invisible. Over time, the tools designed to prevent collapse contribute to it. Control creates rigidity. Standardization reduces resilience. Centralization amplifies failure. The narrowing that once protected survival becomes a liability when conditions change beyond recognition. The record shows this pattern repeating. Civilizations rise, expand, strain, and fall. Each believes itself unprecedented. Each inherits systems shaped by forgotten fears. Each mistakes endurance for understanding. Modern observers often look back at Sumer searching for beginnings of writing, law, urban life. But these searches miss something essential. Sumer is less a point of origin than a hinge. It marks a turn away from something broader, something less stable, but perhaps more flexible. That turn was never explained. It was enacted. The cost of that enactment has been paid repeatedly, not all at once, but gradually, through cycles of overreach and collapse, through the quiet erosion of meaning, through the normalization of strain. Yet within this long repetition, traces of the earlier tension remain. They surface when systems fail unexpectedly. When people sense that efficiency has replaced wisdom, when progress feels hollow, when endurance no longer feels like living. These moments echo the unease embedded in the earliest texts, the sense that something important lies outside the permitted frame, the feeling that stability has been purchased through omission. The Sumerians did not resolve this tension. They chose survival. That choice shaped everything that followed. It allowed civilization to persist, but it also ensured that its deepest questions would remain unanswered. As centuries pass and civilizations inherit the same posture, the unanswered questions accumulate. They do not disappear. They wait beneath layers of order, re-emerging whenever continuity falters. What makes Sumer remarkable is not that it began civilization, but that it reveals civilization's first compromise, a decision made quietly without proclamation, to trade breadth for durability. That trade is still being honored. Every system that prioritizes stability over understanding repeats it. Every institution that protects itself through silence echoes it. Every society that treats collapse as anomaly rather than pattern reenacts it. The clay tablets endure because they were designed to endure. They carry records, measurements, names. They do not carry explanation. They do not tell us why civilization took the shape it did. Perhaps that omission is the most honest legacy Sumer left behind. Not an answer, but a gap. Not a beginning, but a boundary. To notice that boundary is to sense how much has been built upon forgetting. To cross it would require more than knowledge. It would require a willingness to reconsider the bargain itself. For now, the bargain holds. Civilization continues, confident in its structures, uncertain of its foundations, moving forward while carrying a silence it no longer recognizes as chosen. And in that silence, the ancient compromise still breathes, shaping the present with the quiet persistence of something never fully faced, never fully resolved, waiting patiently in the long shadow cast by endurance itself. As the long inheritance of Sumerian restraint unfolded, a subtle distortion took hold in how civilizations perceived truth itself. What endured came to be equated with what was true. Longevity became evidence. Survival became validation. Ideas, institutions, and narratives that lasted longest were assumed to be closest to reality, while those that vanished were dismissed as error or weakness. This equation reshaped historical consciousness. Truth was no longer something to be tested against experience, but something to be inferred from persistence. If a system remained standing, it must be right. If a belief endured, it must be necessary. Over time, this logic hardened into assumption. The Sumerians had never claimed this openly. They understood endurance as effort, not proof. Their laments and warnings reveal awareness that survival required compromise. But later cultures, farther removed from the original strain, mistook endurance for inevitability. What lasted became unquestionable. This shift altered the relationship between power and knowledge. Authority no longer needed to persuade, it needed only to persist. Its age became its argument. Dissent was framed not as alternative insight, but as threat to continuity. The longer a structure stood, the more fragile it felt to challenge. In this way, forgetting acquired moral weight. To remember differently was to undermine stability. Memory became regulated not only through institutions but through expectation. People learned which questions felt inappropriate, which curiosities felt dangerous, which doubts felt disloyal. The narrowing that began as adaptation matured into orthodoxy. What could be said shrank. What could be imagined narrowed further. The silence around origins expanded into silence around structure. This silence did not eliminate thought. It redirected it. Intellectual energy flowed into refinement rather than reconsideration. Systems were optimized, not reimagined. Complexity increased within boundaries that remained unexamined. Civilization became elaborate without becoming reflective. This pattern is visible in the evolution of law, theology, and administration. Codes multiply, rituals refine, hierarchies deepen, yet the foundational assumptions beneath them remain untouched. Change occurs horizontally, not vertically. The surface shifts while the base stays fixed. Such stability is impressive. It allows societies to function across centuries, but it also creates blind spots. When reality shifts in ways the base cannot accommodate, the entire structure strains. Responses grow frantic, control tightens, silence deepens. The Sumerians sensed this danger. Their texts are haunted by the possibility that order could unravel without warning. They lived with that awareness. Their successors inherited the order but not the awareness. Confidence replaced caution. As confidence grew, the cost of error increased. Larger systems fail more dramatically. The room for correction shrinks as scale expands. What could once be adjusted locally becomes entrenched globally. At this stage, truth becomes less about correspondence with reality and more about compatibility with the system. Ideas are evaluated not for accuracy, but for stability. What fits survives. What disrupts is dismissed. This filtering shapes collective perception. Over time, people forget that filtering is occurring. The remaining worldview feels complete. Gaps are invisible. Silence feels natural. The danger of this condition lies not in falsehood, but in rigidity. A system that cannot question its foundations cannot adapt when those foundations shift. It mistakes endurance for insight until endurance fails. History records these failures repeatedly. Civilizations collapse under pressures they cannot interpret within existing frames. Explanations arrive too late or not at all. Recovery, if it occurs, rebuilds familiar forms, carrying the same blind spots forward. The Sumerian legacy is woven through this pattern, not as cause but as precedent. They demonstrated that survival was possible through narrowing. That demonstration became instruction, stripped of context. What was lost was the sense that narrowing was a choice. Once choice disappears, structure becomes fate. Fate discourages inquiry. This discouragement reshapes even personal understanding. Individuals internalize limits. They calibrate desire to what seems possible. They learn to endure rather than to ask. Over time, the habit of questioning atrophies. Yet questioning does not vanish entirely. It goes underground. It emerges in art, in mythic fragments, in moments of crisis when explanations fail. It appears as discomfort rather than articulation. The Sumerians left behind many such fragments, inconsistencies in myth, exaggerations in chronology, laments that feel excessive. These are not errors. They are pressure points, places where containment strained. Later cultures smooth these irregularities. They reinterpret them symbolically, academically, safely. The tension dissolves into explanation. The questions lose urgency. But urgency cannot be erased completely. It returns whenever systems reveal their fragility. When endurance falters, truth reasserts itself as something separate from persistence. In those moments, the old bargain becomes visible again. The trade between depth and durability resurfaces. Civilization remembers briefly that it chose survival over understanding. The Sumerians stood at the first articulation of that choice. They did not glorify it. They did not deny its cost. They simply enacted it and moved forward. What followed was not progress in a simple sense, but accumulation. Structures built upon structures, each layer inheriting silence. The distance from the original compromise grew until it could no longer be felt. Yet the cost accumulated as well. Each generation paid a little more in rigidity, in disconnection, in diminished imagination. The price was spread thin enough to feel tolerable, but never fully paid. The silence that protected early civilization became the silence that constrains later ones. What once preserved life eventually limits it. This is not an argument for abandoning order, but a reminder that order is not neutral. It carries memory within it, whether acknowledged or not. When memory is curated too carefully, truth becomes brittle. The Sumerians understood brittleness. They lived beside rivers that could erase cities overnight. Their restraint was informed by that knowledge. What later civilizations inherited was the restraint without the memory. As the night stretches long and history settles into repetition, the question of truth remains unresolved. Is truth what lasts or what listens? Is endurance evidence or simply habit refined over time? The ancient clay does not answer. It holds records, not explanations. It endures, quietly, reminding us that survival can be mistaken for wisdom, and that the most persistent silences are often the ones that shape reality most profoundly. In that silence, truth waits, not as certainty, but as tension, asking only to be noticed before endurance once again mistakes itself for understanding. At a certain distance, the Sumerian legacy stops looking like a foundation and begins to resemble a shadow. It stretches across later civilizations not as instruction, but as orientation. People inherit not specific beliefs, but habits of attention, where to look, where not to linger, which absences to ignore. Over time, these habits become invisible, shaping perception without announcing themselves. One of the most enduring habits is the treatment of collapse as interruption rather than message. When systems fail, the instinct is to restore function as quickly as possible. Repair precedes reflection. Continuity is prioritized over comprehension. The faster normality returns, the less space there is to ask what the failure revealed. This instinct traces back to the earliest urban responses to disaster. Sumerian cities were rebuilt repeatedly, often on the same sites, using the same designs, under the same assumptions. Flood layers were covered, not studied. The land was raised, the walls restored, the records resumed. Survival demanded speed. Delay invited vulnerability. Over generations, speed became virtue. The ability to resume order quickly was praised. The impulse to pause and reinterpret faded. Collapse became something to overcome, not something to learn from. This posture reshaped memory. What mattered was not what happened, but what continued. Events that did not fit into continuity were compressed or erased. The record favoured restoration narratives. Disruption was framed as temporary deviation rather than structural signal. As this approach spread, civilizations grew skilled at managing crises without absorbing their lessons. Each recovery reinforced the belief that the system itself was sound. Failures were attributed to external forces, nature, fate, divine displeasure, rather than to internal design. This attribution protected identity. If collapse originated outside human choice remained unquestioned. The system could be reaffirmed without modification. Responsibility dissolved into circumstance. The emotional relief of this framing cannot be overstated. To believe that suffering is unavoidable is easier than to believe it is systemic. Acceptance costs less than transformation. Endurance feels safer than uncertainty. Yet this safety carries delayed consequences. Systems that avoid learning from failure accumulate hidden vulnerabilities. They grow impressive in scale but brittle in structure. When disruption finally exceeds their capacity to absorb it, collapse arrives not as correction, but as shock. The archaeological record reflects this pattern across cultures and centuries. The larger and more centralized the system, the more dramatic its fall. Recovery becomes slower, rebuilding grows harder, the cycle tightens. The Sumerians lived early enough to sense this dynamic without fully articulating it. Their laments acknowledge loss but do not analyze its cause. Their rituals soothe grief but do not interrogate structure. Their caution prevented immediate catastrophe, but it also limited long-term adaptability. Later civilizations inherited the caution without the context. They learned how to restore but not how to reconsider. Each generation became more skilled at continuity and less capable of reflection. This imbalance affects not only institutions but inner life. People learn to normalize strain. Stress becomes background, discomfort becomes routine. The expectation of difficulty lowers sensitivity to warning signs. When everything feels burdensome, nothing feels urgent. Urgency is essential for change. Without it, even clear signals are ignored. The system adapts by dulling perception rather than altering behavior. The Sumerian silence around origins plays a role here. Without a remembered alternative, the present feels inevitable. Without a sense of choice, critique feels futile. The imagination contracts to fit what exists. This contraction is not imposed by force. It is learned through repetition, through stories that emphasize endurance, through rituals that reward compliance, through histories that smooth over rupture. Over time, the absence of alternatives feels natural. People stop noticing what is missing. The world appears complete. Yet completeness is an illusion maintained by omission. What has been left out does not disappear, it accumulates as pressure. It surfaces as anxiety, dissatisfaction, or the sense that effort no longer yields meaning. In moments when systems falter, economic strain, environmental stress, social fracture, this pressure becomes visible. Familiar explanations thin, confidence erodes. People sense that restoration alone may not suffice. These moments echo the unease embedded in the earliest urban records. The feeling that order is provisional, that survival has conditions, that something essential lies beyond the structures built to endure. The Sumerians chose to step away from that edge. Their world demanded it. They could not afford prolonged uncertainty. Their restraint was practical, even compassionate. What followed, however, was not simply inheritance, but amplification. Each generation carried the restraint further, stripping away its original humility. The silence hardened. By the time modern observers encounter these ancient patterns, the silence feels ancient, immutable. Civilization appears to have always been this way. The possibility that it could be otherwise feels abstract. Yet abstraction is itself a sign of distance from choice. When choices recede into the past, they masquerade as nature. The Sumerian record, read closely, resists this masquerade. It does not celebrate order, it endures it. It does not glorify continuity, it manages it. Its quiet tone carries the weight of necessity, not triumph. That tone is easy to miss. It requires listening not only to what is written, but to what is avoided. It asks for attention to absence, to repetition, to the emotional temperature of the text. What emerges is not a story of beginnings, but of decisions made under pressure. Decisions to prioritize stability, decisions to narrow attention, decisions to survive. These decisions shaped the future profoundly. They allowed civilization to persist, but they also ensured that persistence would be confused with purpose. As the long night of history unfolds, this confusion remains active. Systems continue to endure. People continue to adapt. The deeper questions remain deferred. Yet deferral is not resolution. What is postponed returns in altered form. The costs of silence accumulate. The pressure grows. The Sumerians sensed this accumulation without naming it. Their world was too close to the brink. They chose caution. That choice echoes still. To notice the echo is not to condemn it, but to recognize its weight. Civilization did not emerge whole. It was assembled through compromise. That compromise lives on, shaping what can be said, what can be imagined, what can be remembered. And as endurance continues to be mistaken for understanding, the ancient shadow lengthens, quiet, patient, waiting, holding within it the unasked possibility that survival, while necessary, is not the same as knowing why one survives at all. There comes a point in the long arc of endurance when restraint no longer feels like choice, but like atmosphere. By then, the narrowing has worked its way so deeply into perception that even the idea of something missing feels foreign. Civilization breathes its own limits as if they were air. This is where the Sumerian legacy becomes most elusive, not in what was built, but in how reality itself was framed. The earliest cities taught people how to live inside systems. Streets organized movement, calendars organized time, laws organized behavior. Over generations, these frameworks trained attention outward, toward function, away from reflection. Life became a series of roles performed within inherited boundaries. Meaning flowed from alignment, not exploration. As this alignment stabilized, something subtle happened to imagination. It did not vanish, but it learned to operate in sanctioned spaces. Creativity was allowed in ornament, in praise, in repetition of mythic forms.